On a blistering June morning in 1899 out on the remote plains of eastern Texas, a neighbor's casual visit to the Yates family homestead led to a discovery that would haunt the small community of Cedar Creek for generations. Inside the simple wooden home, 5 young children lay lifeless in their beds, their lives ended by the same hands that had once comforted and cared for them. Margaret Yates, once seen as the ideal frontier wife, had taken her children's lives before attempting to end her own. But this wasn't the act of a cold-hearted killer. It was the heartbreaking result of a slow unraveling one that had been happening in plain sight, though few had truly seen it. The signs had been there for months, whispered about around store counters, brushed off as nothing more than a tired mother's mood swings. So what could lead a devoted mother to something so unimaginable? The answer lies in the crushing isolation of frontier life, the impossible weight of expectations, and a community's failure to recognize the quiet cries for help that echoed across the Texas plains like wind through an empty house. Before we go deeper into this devastating piece of forgotten Texas history, just a quick reminder, this channel isn't for everyone. It's for those willing to look at the darker chapters of America's past. If you're one of them, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. We've built a thoughtful, curious community here, and if you're still listening, chances are you're one of us. Now let's go back to that summer. The Texas sun was hot, but it couldn't match the heat of the pressure that was quietly building inside the Yates home. In 1899, Cedar Creek, Texas, was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, but somehow the most important truths stayed hidden behind closed doors. A small farming community of just 300 or so, it sat like a lone speck in the wide, dusty sprawl of eastern Texas. The nearest town was a full day's ride away. Life out there was hard. The land demanded everything and gave little back. It was exactly the sort of place that drew men like Thomas Yates, a determined German immigrant who had arrived 5 years earlier with little more than strong hands and big dreams. Under the Homestead Act, he claimed 160 acres, built a 2-story home by hand, and quickly became one of the more successful farmers in the area. His wheat fields stretched for miles, golden waves shifting in the Texas wind. But no farm could thrive on work alone. A man like Thomas needed a wife, someone to raise children, run the home, and provide moral structure for the family. That's where Margaret Owen came in. At 19, Margaret was already considered late to marry by frontier standards, but her grace, education, and soft-spoken nature made her a highly desirable match. She grew up in Austin, the daughter of a state government clerk. Her life had been comfortable, quiet, and cultured, none of which prepared her for the harshness of life on the Texas plains. Her parents, eager to see her settled, agreed to Thomas's proposal after only 2 meetings. The wedding took place in the spring of 1892. A modest ceremony at Cedar Creek's small Methodist church. Margaret wore her mother's altered wedding dress, her auburn hair pinned neatly, and her green eyes full of hope. The townspeople thought she and Thomas made a striking couple, him with his strong frame and serious face, her with her quiet elegance. In those early years, Margaret seemed like the model frontier wife. She learned to milk cows, churn butter, and grow a garden that became the pride of the area. She sewed clothes by hand, preserved food for winter, and cooked meals that earned Thomas praise for being the luckiest man in 3 counties. When their first child, William, was born in 1893, everyone commented on her natural mothering instincts. Surely, they said, she would raise a fine brood of strong sons, and the children did come. William was followed by Sarah in 1894, twins James and Mary in 1896, and baby Samuel in 1898. Each child was seen as another blessing, each birth a celebration of the family's prosperity and God's favor. Margaret poured everything into being a mother. She made the children's clothes, taught them to read using her worn wedding Bible, and kept order at the table with quiet discipline. Visitors often remarked on how neat and well-behaved the children were, especially given how rough life was on the farm. But as time passed, people started to notice small changes in Margaret. The laughter that had once come easily now felt strained. At church or town gatherings, she smiled less and spoke even less. When asked how she was managing so many little ones, she would give the same reply: "The Lord gives strength for all burdens." But the words always came with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. In truth, Margaret was beginning to feel trapped. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. With Thomas often gone on business, sometimes for days or even weeks, she'd go without adult conversation. For long stretches, the children, though dearly loved, were constant demands on her time. Cooking, cleaning, teaching, healing, managing the home. It never ended. The winter of 1897 hit especially hard. A late freeze wiped out much of the wheat crop. Then came a drought, leaving many families, including the Yateses, scrambling. Thomas began traveling farther, taking on odd jobs and cattle drives to make ends meet. Margaret was left alone more than ever, isolated with 5 small children and no way to call for help. It was during one of these absences that something deeply troubling happened. Helen Morrison, their closest neighbor, came by to check on Margaret. She found baby Samuel wailing in his cradle, clearly not changed or comforted for hours. It took several minutes for Margaret to answer the door. Her hair was messy, her dress stained, and her eyes looked distant. "Margaret, are you all right?" Helen asked gently, trying to see into the house. "Everything is fine," Margaret replied, her voice oddly high-pitched. "The children are just resting." Helen insisted on coming inside. She found the 4 older children sitting quietly at the kitchen table, looking pale and uneasy. Baby Samuel was red-faced and soaked. The house was a mess, dishes everywhere, laundry on the floor, and a strange, sour smell in the air. "When did you last eat, Margaret?" Helen asked, concerned by how thin and hollow her friend looked. Margaret stared for a long moment. "Eat, I. The children need to eat. They're always hungry, always needing something. I can't keep up." Helen stayed the rest of the day to help, but what unsettled her most was Margaret's behavior. She'd start tasks and then stop halfway through, as if lost in thought. She spoke sharply to the kids, nothing like the patient mother everyone remembered. And more than once, Helen noticed Margaret staring at Samuel, not with affection, but something closer to resentment. When Thomas returned 2 days later, Helen pulled him aside and voiced her concerns. Maybe Margaret needed help, a hired girl, even just a break. Thomas listened, then shrugged it off. "Women get emotional after childbirth," he said. "She's always been a little sensitive. Grew up in the city. She just needs to toughen up like real frontier women do." But she didn't toughen up, and the signs kept coming. Sarah Brennan, who ran the general store, mentioned that Margaret had come in twice for the same supplies. Confused when reminded she had already bought them. At church, people noticed her crying during hymns, silent tears running down her cheeks as she stared ahead. The slow unraveling continued and no one stepped in. Haunted look. She stared at Mrs. Morrison without speaking for a long moment before finally stepping aside to let her in. Inside the house, the air was heavy and still. The curtains were drawn, and the rooms were dim. It took a moment for Mrs. Morrison's eyes to adjust, and when they did, what she saw chilled her. The 4 older children lay in their beds, silent and unmoving. At first, she thought they were asleep, but something about their stillness was off to complete, too unnatural. "Margaret, what's happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. Margaret didn't respond. She simply stood in the doorway, baby Samuel cradled in her arms. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving at all. His face was pale, his tiny lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-breath. Mrs. Morrison stepped closer, panic rising in her chest. She reached for the infant, but Margaret pulled away, holding him tighter. "It's done," she whispered. "They're safe now. They won't feel the fear anymore." The whispers are quiet. Realizing the horror of what had taken place, Mrs. Morrison rushed from the house, screaming for help. Within hours, news had spread through Cedar Creek. By the time Thomas returned from Houston, the sheriff and several townspeople were already at the Yates farm. The coroner confirmed the worst. All 5 children were gone. There were no signs of violence, no bruises, no wounds. It was suspected that Margaret had given them a combination of laudanum and another household substance, a quiet end meant to protect them from whatever threat she believed was coming. Margaret herself was found unresponsive, sitting in a chair near the fireplace, clutching an empty bottle. She had tried to take her own life but had survived. She was taken into custody, but no trial ever took place. The doctors who examined her declared her unfit to stand trial, and she was committed to the state hospital in Austin, where she would live out the rest of her days in silence. No one in Cedar Creek ever forgot what happened. For years, the Yates house stood abandoned, slowly rotting under the Texas sun. Children dared each other to peek inside. Adults avoided the place entirely, and every June when the air turned hot and heavy, the older folks would speak in hushed tones about the summer when madness stole 5 young lives. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates the real and often overlooked tragedies from our past. Hit like to support the channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the forgotten corners of American history. Children, there was also a surprising degree of sympathy for Margaret. Some viewed her not as a criminal, but as a woman pushed past her limits by isolation, mental illness, and the crushing demands of frontier life. She must have snapped, one neighbor said. Anyone would, living like that, no help, no rest. 5 kids and a farm to run, in the absence of proper mental health care or social services. Many in the town didn't know how else to make sense of what had happened. The tragedy became a cautionary tale whispered around church potlucks and general store counters, a grim reminder of what could happen when someone is left to struggle alone for too long. Margaret was declared legally insane and committed permanently to the state hospital in Austin. She lived out the rest of her life in a quiet ward, rarely speaking, sometimes humming lullabies to herself in the middle of the night. She never asked about Thomas or the children again. Thomas Yates left Cedar Creek soon after the funerals. The farm was abandoned and left to fall into disrepair, eventually swallowed by weeds and weather. For years, the house stood empty, a quiet, rotting shell of what once had been a home full of life. Even now, generations later, the story of Margaret Yates and her children lingers in the memory of the region. Locals still talk about the tragedy in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might stir something best left undisturbed. It's a haunting reminder of how fragile the line between order and collapse can be, and how easily it can be crossed when help arrives too late. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, share it with someone who appreciates true stories that reveal the darker side of human nature. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real-life mysteries from history's forgotten corners. Children, there was also an unsettling sense of relief among some that Margaret's erratic behavior had finally come to an end, even if the outcome was horrifying. A few people quietly admitted they had long sensed something was deeply wrong, but felt powerless to step in. After all, it was a family matter. Mrs. Morrison, overwhelmed by guilt, spent hours giving detailed statements to the authorities. She recounted troubling changes she'd noticed in Margaret's behavior in the weeks before the tragedy. She kept saying she had to protect the children. Helen told the sheriff through tears, "I thought she meant from animals' illness, accidents, not from life itself." The legal outcome was swift. Margaret was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial and was committed to the state asylum in Austin, where she would live the rest of her days. She never showed remorse, insisting until her death 15 years later that she had done the right thing and that her children were safer this way. Thomas Yates sold the farm shortly after the funerals and left Cedar Creek for good. No one ever saw him again, though stories circulated for years that he'd started over under a different name somewhere out west, trying to escape what had happened. The Yates house sat empty for years, slowly falling apart. Locals said it was haunted. Some swore they saw lights in the windows or heard strange sounds echoing through the night. Whether those stories were rooted in truth or just lingering guilt, no one ever went in to find out. The tragedy left behind difficult questions that the community didn't want to answer. How many other women out there were silently struggling with overwhelming burdens, cut off from help and misunderstood? How many warning signs were being missed across scattered farmsteads? Just like the Yateses, Dr. Crawford was deeply shaken by his inability to recognize how serious Margaret's condition had become. He began looking into the limited research available on women's mental health. What he found suggested that cases like Margaret's were more common than people realized, especially among women isolated on the frontier, expected to carry impossible loads alone. After his death, personal notes revealed how much the case had impacted him. "We've built a society that demands everything from women, especially mothers, and then acts shocked when they collapse," he wrote. Margaret Yates wasn't born a killer. She was shaped by circumstances that would have broken anyone. The tragedy also exposed just how poorly mental illness was understood at the time. Margaret's behavior had been brushed off as hysteria or nervousness, treated with tonics, judgment, and little else. The most painful realization: this wasn't an act of cruelty. The community had failed those children by turning a blind eye. For years, the Yates murders were whispered about across Texas. Some parents used the story to teach their children the importance of looking out for others. Informal support networks began forming in farming communities. But the deeper issues: the mental strain placed on women, the stigma around mental health, the silence surrounding suffering, mostly went unaddressed. The 5 Yates children were buried together in a small plot at the Cedar Creek Cemetery. Thomas bought the space before leaving town forever. The simple headstones show only names and dates. Nothing on them reveals how their lives ended. In time, the graves drew visitors, people fascinated by the more unsettling stories of the frontier. Local historians even uncovered other, less documented cases of mothers who harmed their own families under similar pressures. It seemed Margaret's story wasn't unique. It was part of a wider pattern that people had been too afraid to face. Medical journals from the era made vague references to prairie madness or frontier fever, terms used to explain breakdowns among isolated women. But these conditions were usually chalked up to weakness or oversensitivity, not recognized as real, treatable illnesses. Margaret spent the rest of her life in the asylum, where records show she caused no problems. She lived in her own world, separate from reality. She never talked about the children. Staff often saw her setting places at a table for 5, chatting with invisible companions as if they were still with her. In her mind, she had saved them and they were waiting for her, safe and happy. The Yates family tragedy remains one of the darkest stories from the American frontier. It forces us to look past romanticized images of pioneering life and see the toll it took on real families. It reminds us of the price that women and children often paid for westward expansion. Margaret wasn't a monster. Even though what she did was unimaginable, she was a woman crushed by expectations, abandoned by the systems meant to help her, and left to spiral until it was too late. Her story shows us just how dangerous the gaps in understanding and support can be. The warning signs had been there for months. In another time, with better awareness and more support, things might have ended differently. Her children could have lived long lives, shaped the future instead of becoming a footnote in its history. Perhaps the most haunting part of the story is how easily it might have been prevented, and how many other stories like it may have unfolded quietly across the frontier, never discovered, never told. The Texas plains hold many secrets. Not all of them are written down. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything came to light, or do darker truths still lie buried in the soil? The frontier was a place where people vanished, where families were lost without notice. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think other tragedies like this went unnoticed? How many other women like Margaret suffered in silence until it was too late? If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into America's forgotten history. Hit the bell so you don't miss any of our future investigations. And share this video with someone ready to confront the parts of our past that many would rather forget. Until next time, remember, some of the most terrifying stories aren't fiction. They're the ones we chose not to see. See you in the next dark chapter of American history.